Man, Stephen Furtick is incredible. It's a little bit awkward though, because as I was sitting there listening to him, it was just kind of weird because I was gonna say everything that he said, like all of it. Just exactly what he said, the whole church. I was gonna do all of that tonight with the chariots of fire and all of that. I don't know if you saw my notes or what, but it's just a little bit awkward. And so if you liked last night, just know that that's what I was gonna say, tonight, right? So anyway. Yeah, it's so great to be here with you guys. Man, I love this church. I love what God is doing in our church tonight. We're going to head in a little different direction tonight. I'm not the big, rah-rah kind of guy. That's not my style. That's not my thing. But what I do want to do is just talk a little bit about a challenge that we're facing. Kind of have a family living room, just kind of talk about some things that we're dealing with as a church. And just kind of, because I consider all you guys to be family, you guys are brothers and sisters, I just want to let you in on a little bit of a challenge that we're facing. Now here's the thing you need to know about this challenge. Number one, and this is the good news, it's not insurmountable. This is something that we can and we will overcome. But the other thing that you need to know about this challenge is that it's very real. Now, it's not something that just only our church is facing. In fact, this is a challenge that all churches across the West, the United States, Canada, much of Europe, they're facing a very similar challenge. But this is a challenge that all churches, many churches are facing. But it's one that if we don't take it seriously, if we don't engage it, if we don't deal with it, if we don't talk about it, this challenge has the very real possibility of being the end of our church one day in the future. And this challenge is pretty simple. It can be summed up in one word. It's simply this: engagement. Engagement. Engagement is about focus, right? It's about your attention. When something has you engaged, when you're into something, that means it has your attention. You're kind of focused on it. We get that. We understand what that's like. When you get into a relationship with someone, like a romantic relationship, often for the first time, you're engaged. You're in. You're all in. I remember whenever Heather and I, whenever we first met each other, that's what it was like for me. I was completely smitten with her right away. I mean, it's just all of my focus was on her. I was having a hard time concentrating at work just because I was so focused on Heather. I was engaged. We weren't formally engaged. That hadn't happened yet, but just my attention was on her. I was focused on her. That's what it is to be engaged in something, and that's what happened in that relationship. We started dating. In fact, we dated for about a year, and then after a year, we got formally engaged, and then here's what's cool. 16 years ago tonight, right here in this auditorium, we got married. So it's our 16th anniversary tonight. Yeah. Auditorium looked a little different back then. Really blue, a lot of plants, plexiglass pulpits, flags everywhere. It was a totally different kind of place. But we got married in here 16 years ago. But that's what engagement is. That's kind of what happens. You understand this whenever you get into a relationship. You become engaged with someone. They take all of your focus, all of your attention. But we also know what it's like through the analogy of relationships to see what happens when people in a relationship become disengaged, don't we? We've seen this. What happens? You have a hot, crazy kind of dating period, and then you get married, and then all of a sudden it's like, what happened to everything that was, sort of going on before we were married? A lot of that romance, a lot of that spark, a lot of that energy seems to be gone, and we see this happen in relationships and in marriages. It happened in our relationship. Heather and I were married, and then soon after we were married, it just you start to lose a little of that engagement. And many of you have lived through this. You know what this is like. Or maybe you grew up in a home where this happened with your parents, where they were engaged. Maybe at one point, there was a lot of engagement in that relationship, but over time, they just begin to kind of drift apart. That's what we say, isn't it? We're drifted apart. People begin to separate. There's this disengagement that happens, and it happens in relationships. Well, guess what? It's happening all over our country when it comes to people's relationship with God and the church. When you think about our cultural approach to God, or the way we think of God as a culture, as a society, we are drifting further and further away from where we used to be. It's interesting, the Pew Research Center, they do a lot of studies, they do a lot of polls and things like this, finding out just different trends in society and stuff like that. And they've been tracking people's religious engagement for years, and here's what's interesting. The number of people who are now identifying as having no religious background, they call them nones, N-O-N-E-S, nones, because when they're answering what's your religious background, they answer none. That number has been on the rise for years. People are no longer feeling any sort of cultural or societal pull to be affiliated with any particular faith or any particular church, whereas in years gone by, it was kind of just expected that you belong to a certain church. Even if you didn't attend there, you didn't have to attend there, but as long as you said, hey, I'm Methodist, or I'm Catholic, or I'm Presbyterian, or I'm non-denominational, whatever, you would at least belong to somewhere. But nowadays, it's becoming more and more and more common for people whenever we ask, or whenever they ask, hey, what's your affiliation? Like, what are you affiliated with? What's your religious background? People are answering none. And it's not just affecting people who we kind of think are out there, people who are not really religious. It's affecting the church. It's affecting all kinds of churches. Churches are feeling this all over the United States. They're feeling the disengagement of their people. They're feeling people who attend church, this is interesting, people who would say that they're committed to this church, that they love this church, but their commitment level is less and less and less. They attend less and less and less. We see this right here at Church on the Move. We see people who would call themselves committed here, who would tell us that they love our church, but they come maybe once, twice a month. It's just whatever they can kind of do. Again, in days gone by, it wasn't this way. If someone was committed to a church, it was like, man, we were there every week. Most weeks we were there. But it's different today because our culture, the natural pull and drift of our culture is that we're disengaging from God. We're disengaging from faith. And so the challenge for us as a church is, all right, how do we get people to re-engage? And here's the thing. This is why I wanted to share this with all of you, because it's not just a problem for the staff of the church anymore. This is something that all of us are going to jump on board with, because here's the truth of it. We can't fix it just as a staff. It's going to take all of us pulling together in the same direction, focused on the same thing, focused on the same strategy, pulling together for the same results, to see people move from being disengaged to being engaged in a local, life-giving church. That's our strategy. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. That's kind of where we're going. So here's what I want to do. I want to spend the first part of this talk just sort of going over some reasons why people are disengaging. There was an interesting blog that was written by a guy named Kerry Newhoff just a few months back. It was an interesting blog. I don't know Kerry. I'm going to have an opportunity to meet him here in a couple of weeks, but he's a pastor and a blogger in Canada. And then he wrote this interesting blog. It was called Why Committed Christians Are Attending Church Less and Less. 10 reasons why committed Christians are attending church less and less. And so I want to walk through just some of these reasons, because I think you're going to find some of these interesting, and I think some of you are going to find that some of these reasons maybe hit a little close to home. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. The first reason was this: greater affluence. This is interesting. It's kind of a catch-22. As we have become wealthier as a nation, as we have become wealthier as individuals, it means that our options go up. We've got more things that we can do. People are traveling more. People are taking more vacations. I remember when I was a kid, I don't know if you remember this. When I was a kid, it was a rare thing for me or any one of my friends to get to go to Disney World. Did you ever hear about that? I mean, nobody went to Disney World. I never knew of hardly anybody. We went like one time whenever I was a kid. Now, every kid has been to Disney World, it feels like. Here's what's interesting. I started taking my family to Disney World back in 2004. I went to Barnes & Noble to check out the guidebooks to see kind of what I needed to prepare for. You know, when you go to Disney, that's one of the things is it's not really a vacation for the parents. It's more like a mission, like a military mission with objectives and that whole thing. And so I'm going to just sort of prepare myself, you know, to get ready for combat, you know. Here's what happens. If you've been to Disney, you know this is true. You need a vacation when you come back from vacation, at Disney if you're parents, right? You understand how that works. And so I was going to Barnes & Noble just to check out what was there, and there was like a little section of books, just a little section, like 2 or 3 books just on how to travel at Disney and what you needed to know. I went for several years. That was something that we just kind of did. We had a lot of kids, and so, that's just kind of what we did is we fell into just going to Disney for several years in a row. And I watched every year. I would go back and look at the same section, and I watched that section over the years grow. Finally, it's taking up like a whole section of books. This is amazing. Why? It's because people are traveling more. Why? Because just greater affluence. As our wealth increases, people just have more options. We've got more things that we can do. We're just taking more vacations. We're out and about. We're just doing stuff. We're taking vacations, doing all kinds of different things. And it just makes church attendance, it's just one more thing that it's on my schedule. We're just busy. We just got a lot of stuff going on. We just have things to do. Whenever I read this, it just made me think of some words that Jesus said, that it would be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with money. It just means that money leads to comfort, leads to ease, leads to pleasure. And for a lot of us, it leads to a mix-up in priorities and to what's really important. That was the first reason. I thought that was interesting. Here's the second one. This is going to hit a little closer to home here. Higher focus on kids' activities. I don't know if anybody else notices this. When I was a kid, you did like one thing at a time. You were in like one sport, and you had like practice a couple days a week, maybe. It was something that you did. But now, I'm just saying, kids' activities, if you let them, can take up your entire life. It's crazy what's going on. Kids have personal coaches, and I'm not saying your kids should never have a personal coach. I'm just saying this is nuts to me when I think about what I grew up with and how things are today. And let me just say this to all of you parents out there. This is just something that you need to know. If your kids' activities make you too busy to take your kids to church, then you're too busy. There's a misconception in our society, in our culture. And I think so many parents, and there's a whole lot of reasons why we think this way, and maybe I'll get into it in a minute to just see what happens, but let me just say this. We think that our job as parents is to make sure that our kids' dreams are completely fulfilled. And guess what? That's not true. Your job as a parent, my job, I got 5 kids, my job as a parent is not to make sure that all of their dreams and aspirations come true. My job is to introduce them to Jesus. My job is to raise a responsible young adult who's selfless, who's caring, who loves other people. Now think about this. Just reason with me for a second. Think about this. If your kids grow up thinking that they're the center of the universe, why? Because your entire life orbits around them, orbits around their schedule, orbits around their activities, orbits around their desires. If they grow up that way, how is it possible for someone like that to grow up being a selfless, responsible person? Think about it. How can someone who's been raised to think that everything revolves around them be unselfish just magically when they turn 21? How does that happen? The answer is, it doesn't. But we've bought into this notion that our job as parents is to make sure that all of your dreams come true. You know what this leads to? I see this all the time. It drives me nuts on the playground. I want to teach my kids some responsibility. I want to teach them consequences of action. So when my kids are on the playground, we let them go. We watch them. They start to climb, and I think, wow, if they fall from there, it's really going to hurt. But I bet they won't do it again. And you know what I see? We let our kids go, and it's amazing how many mothers just come, your child your child was up here, let me get him down. Yeah, we're fine with that. They were stuck, they were crying. Let them learn how to get down. Stop hovering over them, trying to make sure that nothing bad ever happens to them. That's not your job. Your job is to introduce them to Jesus, to teach them to be a responsible and selfless young adult so that they can contribute to society, so that they contribute to a church community, not to orbit your entire life around them. I'm telling you, if your schedule is so packed that you just can't be in church most weekends, I understand occasionally you got to miss, but if you can't be in church most weekends, you're too busy. What message does that send to your kids about the importance of God, about where God falls in terms of priority in your life if you can just skip out whenever you want because you just have another event to go to? I'm just telling you, this is a real problem, and it's creating disengagement, and guess what? It's going to create disengagement even more so. That's going to be magnified in your kids. This is dangerous. Here's the next one. This is number 4. I'm kind of skipping around. I didn't use all 10 in this list, so here's the 4th thing that he listed: blended families. This is heartbreaking. Divorce has caused some major problems. I don't even have to say that we all know that that's true. But this is affecting our kids. This is affecting the future of our church. Think about this. If your kids come to church every single weekend, the best that we get with your kids in a year is 52 hours a year. That's it. That's all the interaction that they have with us as a church. Just 52. That's if they come every single weekend. For so many kids, they're spending one weekend with mom, another weekend with dad. It just rotates. You cut that number in half. And then you add in birthday parties, just other events, other things. If somebody gets sick, whatever, that number shrinks down from there. Divorce is a terrible thing. It not only wrecks homes, it ripples and ripples and ripples into the future. This is causing disengagement. And again, if you're here and you're divorced, I'm not here to condemn you or make you feel awful about this. I'm just saying, this is part of what's leading to disengagement in church. Here's the next one. Online options. Oh, you just hit my hot button issue. Online options. We started broadcasting our services live about 2 years ago. And you know what was interesting? We saw the effect in attendance almost immediately. Guys, we did not start the online option so that you could just stay home in bed without coming to church at all. Let me talk about this for just a second. Let me just hit on this for a second. And let me just reason with you. If the online experience is the same as coming live, it's the same as sitting in the room, if you could get the same thing, then why did we build a building at all? Why do we even have this? Think about it for a second. We could save so much money. We wouldn't have to have volunteers. We could do this so much more efficiently and cheaply if there was nothing about gathering. If the gathering together didn't matter, if the assembling of ourselves physically together in one location or in different locations around the city, if that wasn't important, then why would we do it? Why do we bother with it? The reason that we do it is because something happens when we gather together. There's more here than just watching something online. I can't tell you how many times I have come to church. I've sat through the service, and the service was great, but what God wanted to do in me that weekend was through one of my friends. Was through someone in the church who just said something to me, I just bumped into. It was an accidental conversation. I wasn't planning to talk to them, but just something happened, and God did something in me on that weekend, and it didn't even happen in between the beginning and the end of the service, but it was just because I was around family. Guys, this is more than an experience. That's what we're used to in our culture. We're used to experiences. We're used to observing something, sitting in a dark theater and not knowing anybody around us. Guys, church is different than that. The goal of a church is not to come in and sit and watch and then go home and try not to talk to anybody, as much as possible. The goal is to come and engage because this is a family. And we get to have a family reunion every 7 days. That's what this is all about. We're a family together. And when you say, you know what, I can just get the same thing by watching online, you're cheating yourself. The person who loses isn't just us, it's you most of all. And you know who really suffers? And this is what always happens. This is what I've noticed in most selfish decisions. You know who suffers the most? Kids. Because there is no online option for your children. Guys, this is causing disengagement in our church. And it's got to stop. Here's the next one. Number 8. Failure, this is kind of a gut punch. Failure to see a direct benefit. I don't need to go. This is an interesting phenomenon of our culture. I was thinking about this reason, just kind of meditating on it and thinking about how this happens and the implications of all this. It's fascinating. We live in a different world today than I think ever before in the history of the human race. The rate of change, I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about this, but the rate of change that you and I experience in our lifetime is greater than any other rate of change that any group of human beings has ever experienced in the history of the world. Things change so quickly. Let me just have a show of hands. How many of you are using the exact same cell phone that you used 5 years ago? You haven't switched at all. You're still using the same one from 5 years ago. Raise your hand. Somebody is pulling somebody's hand up back here, making her admit it. That's fantastic. All right, let's do this. How many of you are using the same cell phone, the exact same cell phone? You haven't had a new cell phone in 2 years. Yours is no more than 2 years old. A few of you. Look at that. So how many of you have had a new cell phone in the last year? Raise your hand. Wow. Yeah, me too. So what? Things change so fast. I want you to think about that cell phone that you used 5 years ago. What if I made you go back and use that cell phone now? Listen to the groaning. Guys, we're talking about 5 years, just 5 years ago. That's like such a blip in the bucket of time. I mean, that's nothing. It's just nothing. 5 years. Think of how comfortable we are. This is what's interesting. When things change at this rapid rate like they do, we just get comfortable with things going obsolete. We're just used to laying things down that are useless to us, aren't we? It's like, I don't use that anymore. I used to do that, but I don't do that anymore. Think of all the technologies. There are whole industries we could talk about that are not the same as they used to be, that are almost obsolete. I mean, the newspaper industry is going through something like this kind of right now. They're struggling to figure out where their place is in the world just because of what the rate of change. This is crazy. Remember, fax machines. If you make me use a fax machine, I want to punch you in the face. I hate fax machines. Remember all of that. Remember Saturday morning cartoons? Do you remember this, where you had to wake up on Saturday morning? My kids can watch cartoons like 24 hours a day. They don't have to wait for anything. There's no delayed gratification. It's just whatever you want. It's on demand. I mean, remember, it's crazy how many things have changed. Things are just, and we get comfortable with that. But don't think that doesn't have an effect on your psyche. Don't think that doesn't have an effect on the way you see the world. We're just used to things changing. Here's the other thing that I've noticed, is that we just expect things that are impossible now to soon be possible. Think about that. Think about how different that is. If you got sick 100, 200 years ago with a fatal disease, I mean, there was no hope. You were just, I'm going to die. That was just the way that it was. There was no hope for a potential cure. Now we live expecting that one day we will hear the words, "We found the cure for cancer." I hope they find it. I sincerely do. But that's just crazy when you think about it. We just expect that those things will happen. Think about it. I mean, if you worked with, if you were a tradesman, 100, 200 years ago, think about this. The tools that you used were more than likely the tools that your father used, and more than likely the tools that his father before him used, and his father before him. Many of those practices, they went back for centuries. Nowadays, young people grow up thinking that if they had to use and work on the same platform that their parents worked on, that something is way wrong, that we ought to be doing something different, that history should be moving forward, that we should be making progress at this kind of rate. But here's where this is dangerous. We just get comfortable expecting that things are no longer needed, and that we are more and more and more as a society self-sufficient. Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York City, right in Manhattan. He wrote a book on preaching. It's a fascinating book, and he's dealing with just how you preach in our, what he calls, late modern culture. And he writes a description in his book that I think is fascinating, that's just a great picture of what's going on in the world around us. Look at this quote here. It says this: "We have come to realize that we don't need God to explain the world we see. Science does that job for us. We don't need God or religion to be moral, to love and work for a better world, or to have meaning and fulfillment in life." Next slide. "What we need is to be free. Free." This is great. "To live life as we see fit." Now that's the key right there. We want to live life as we see fit, and to work together to make the world a better and more just place to live. This is the point of view of our culture. It's interesting how we got here. I'll explain it to you really quick. In ancient times, the point of view of most of the rest of the world, and this is fascinating, was that the individual isn't really important. That what matters is family, what matters is the clan, what matters is the group. That all of us together are way more important than an individual. The individual rights weren't really something that were celebrated, weren't really something that was held up as being something that we should protect. What we held on to were the family, the clan. Well, here's what's interesting. Christianity comes along. And Christianity says, no. Christianity says every individual has value. Why? Because we're made in the image and the likeness of God. And so because of that, we started to elevate individual rights. We started to say that individuals have rights. This is what led to the ending of the slavery movement, of what was going on with slavery. This is what led to the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. This is what led to those things. It was grounded in the scriptures. It was grounded in Christianity. It came from those roots where we said, no, because God has made each person, then therefore each person has dignity, and each person is worthy of respect. Each person has intrinsic value. But here's what we've done as a culture. We have divorced God from our individual rights. Think about this. Follow it with me for just a second. We've divorced God from our individual rights. So we still believe that the individual is important, but why? Why is the individual important? Give me a reason. Because we are. Because everyone should. God has been disconnected from that value. Now, this has huge implications. Because what it means is that every individual, the whole point of every individual having value is so that every individual, no matter what's inside of them, is free to express the dreams that they have on the inside of them. Think about that. As we see fit. That's the whole idea, is that we get to express what's valuable as we see fit to make the world a better and more just place to live. But here's the problem. How do we agree? Without God, how do we agree on what makes the world a better place? How do we agree? Think about this. What did the Nazis think would make the world a better place? What did apartheid think would make the world a better place? What did the KKK think would make the world a better place? See, when we divorce God from this, here's what happens. Every single person gets to choose what's right or wrong for them. And then how do you draw a line anywhere? How do you say that what's in your heart? And this, guys, this isn't our movies. This isn't everything. I mean, this is what's, and I don't think there's any sort of like particular agenda behind all of these movies. Think about movies like The Little Mermaid. Family says, don't marry the human. The Ariel, oh, but it's in her heart. It's what she's always wanted. Who wins in the end? The individual. Frozen. I just like stepped on some of your, messiahs there here. Listen. Frozen. I don't care what anybody else says. I don't care what society says. I don't care what my family says. I'm doing what's right for me. The individual has value, but the individual is under God. Otherwise, we have total anarchy and chaos, which is exactly where we're headed. When we look around our world, that's what we see. The individual does have rights, but the individual has these rights because God gave them to us. That's the key. But when you divorce God from this, we just end up chasing, and this is what happens. We've divorced God, and now we no longer need him. God has become, effectively for many people, obsolete. He's like an old cell phone. I remember when I used to need that. I remember when I used to go to church every week. I remember when I used to be involved. I remember when I used to serve. I remember when I used to be in a small group, but I don't do that like I used to anymore. Why? Because I just don't need it like I used to. Here's the next one, the ninth one. This is the last one. We're going to kind of park here and then move into our strategy for how we're going to get people re-engaged. But check this out. And this is something that we as a church have to take responsibility for. Valuing attendance over engagement. This is just a dynamic that you probably have never dealt with because most of you are not in full-time ministry, but it's just a thing that happens amongst ministers, is that whenever we get together and we start talking, it doesn't take very long for this one question to kind of come out in a conversation amongst ministers, and that is, how many people attend your church? And this is just sort of a thing that we just throw these numbers out when we talk about it on Twitter. It was this many people who came. It was this. And listen, I'm not against big. I'm not against a lot of people. I'm not against going for more people and big numbers because every number matters. Every number has a story. Every number represents an individual. That's a great thing. We should celebrate those things. But here's the thing, and this can happen in many churches. It's been something that we've had to struggle with over the years, is that you can start to value attendance over engagement. So much so, really, attendance is the only thing we really measure. All we really know is that people come on a weekend, and that's really all that we see. But attendance is so surface level. There's so many people who just attend, but they do not engage. And what we're looking to do is to get people to stop attending and to start engaging. That doesn't mean we don't want you to come. That came out wrong. I want you to come every week. But I want you to come more than just to attend, but I want you to come to engage. Attendance is what happens here. Engagement is what happens here. Let me explain what that means. Jonathan Edwards, the great revivalist of the 1700s, in fact, he was largely responsible for what was called the Great Awakening, a huge revival that happened in the United States a few hundred years ago. And Jonathan Edwards wrote about something. He wrote about something called the religious affections. It's this interesting concept that means that basically there are things that you can know to be true, but those things that you know to be true won't really change your behavior or your actions until they move into your heart, until they affect what he would call your wants, your deepest desires. And this is something that we can all relate to. I think the easiest way to relate to this is around the idea of diet. If you've ever tried to go on a diet and you've looked at food and you've said to yourself, I know in my head I don't need to eat that, but I'm gonna eat it anyway, then you understand what this is about. You knew in your head what was the right thing to do, but your desires overruled your head. And Jonathan Edwards said this. He said that people don't change just because their thinking changes. People can understand what the right thing is. He says, but it's when your desires change, when you reorder your desires, when you change what you find most beautiful, most attractive in this world, most worthy of pursuing. When those things change, then your heart kicks in, and then everything changes. This is an interesting concept. He talks about valuing really the heart more than just the head. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to engage, to move past just being casual attenders and be engaged in the life of what God is trying to do in our church. Now, this is a struggle that the church has faced, and this is the good news, from day one. Nothing of what we're facing as a church is anything that the church hasn't faced before. This is something that the Church of Jesus Christ has been through from day one. Let me kind of show you where this is, and this is the text we're going to look at tonight. It's found in Acts 2. This is the beginning. It's the explosion of the church. It's this beautiful story. The day of Pentecost had come. Jesus had ascended into heaven about 50 days earlier, and so the Holy Spirit descends. You remember the story in the upper room where the Holy Spirit falls on these people. They're tongues of fire. They go out, they start speaking in different languages, and all of these people start hearing the works of God, the amazing works of God being declared in their own language. And so Peter takes advantage of the situation. He just jumps up, and Peter starts preaching. He just starts proclaiming Jesus. And if you read in Acts 2 what Peter said, it wasn't easy what he said to them. In fact, he said that Jesus came, and Jesus was the Messiah, and you killed him. I mean, he told people, he said, you were responsible for putting him on the cross. And then he says, but you should repent, and you should accept Jesus as your Lord. And it's just this amazing sermon that Peter gives. And then right at the end, we'll pick it up reading in verse 40. This is kind of how Peter lands the plane. This is sort of the last thing that he says. It says, with many other words, he warned them, and he pleaded with them, save yourselves from this corrupt generation. This is so much where we find ourselves today. This is what is happening in this revival. We're warning you, pleading with you not to get swept up in what's happening in our culture, not to get swept up in what everybody else is doing, but to engage, but to be a part of what's happening in the local church. Look at what Peter says. He says this in verse 41. It says, those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. So the church just explodes onto the scene, this great movement, this incredible thing, this miracle happens where all these people are speaking in different languages. And then 3,000 people come to Christ. They get baptized that very day. And then look what happens after that. And this is really incredible what happens. This is how Christianity got launched into our world. It says they devoted themselves, these 3,000 people, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They devoted themselves to their teaching and to the fellowship. They were devoted to each other. It was like a family dynamic. Check this out. It says, to the breaking of bread, that's talking about communion, and to prayer. And then look at the result of this. This is so cool. It says, everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. You know what's cool? As we've been part of this revival, as we've focused, as we've come together with intentionality to say, God, we're focusing on you. You know what's happened? You know what's been amazing? I've stood down here and I've turned around. It's the great thing about sitting down front is I turned and I've been able to watch you worship. And do you know what I see on your faces? Awe. Everyone is filled with awe. South Campus filled with awe. 180 filled with awe at what God is doing. And then we're hearing stories of healings, of miracles, of things that God is doing. I mean, it's the same pattern that happened right here in Acts 2. It's incredible. And then verse 44, it says, all the believers were together, and they had everything in common, selling their possessions. That's what we're going to do at the end of this service. We're going to have everybody sell all of their possessions and goods. So just get ready. That's what's coming. It's just a heads up. No big deal. They gave to everyone as he had need. And then verse 46, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And then look at the result that happens. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Here's what's cool. Right here in the first century, when the church explodes onto the scene for the very first time, we get a taste of the pattern of engagement. We get to see how this process works. And I want to lay it out for you, and then we'll land this plane and wrap this thing up. All right, let's look back at verse 41. Check this out. It says this: after they heard the message, the first thing that happens is our first step in this process. Baptism. Immediate baptism. You guys have seen this over the past year, but this is what we're working towards. This is what we're passionate about. That's why we talk about it every single week. The immediacy of baptism. Baptism that happens right after every single service. That's why we emphasize it so much, because we see it in the New Testament. We see it here in Acts chapter 2. But here's the thing. Many of us think, well, baptized. I was baptized. That's over and done with. That step, I've checked that off. I'm good to go. I don't have to mess with any of that. But baptism is more than just a one-time event. Baptism is what happens in this room every single time we gather. Because you know what baptism represents? It represents the old you going under the water, right? And a new you coming up. And every time we gather, and every time you hear the scriptures being taught, here's what happens. The old part of you, another part of you that you haven't quite given that area over to Christ yet, that part of you goes down under the washing of the water of the Word, as the Apostle Paul refers to it in Ephesians 5. That part goes under, and a new you comes up. Every time we gather together, it's a chance for another part of us, another part of our thinking, another part of our living, another part of our heart to be baptized. It doesn't mean that every week you should be going back into our baptism room and get baptized, but it means that a part of you internally is being baptized. That's why these gatherings, it's another reason why when we gather, this is so important, because God has work He wants to do in you and in me, and when you're not here, you miss it. The first step is baptism. Then look at the second thing that happens here. Acts 2:42, look at this. It says, they devoted themselves. They were devoted to the apostles' teaching. That means that they were devoted to a core idea, a set of core beliefs about how this thing was going to go forward, about how the church was going to move forward. They were devoted to this and to the fellowship. That means they were devoted to each other. Do you know what this is? This is the next part of our process. You hear us talk about this a lot lately, but it's represented in this thing that we do called the next move. It's about devoting yourself to how we do church, a church on the move, and look at this, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. You know what those are? Those are spiritual disciplines. When you come to the next move, we're going to talk about how we do church at Church on the Move, so that we can all be devoted to each other, because guess what? A church just isn't a spectator sport. A church is something that we're actively involved in, back and forth. It's a give and take. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. When we go and we do this, the next move, that's what the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is you get a spiritual challenge. We're going to talk about spiritual disciplines. Guys, you would be amazed how many people come in there and struggle with their spiritual disciplines, with reading scripture every day, with prayer every day. So what we talk about in there is how you can develop some of those habits. You can gain some accountability. You're going to form some relationships with people that can help to keep you accountable in this area. But you're going to grow when you go through this process. It's about devoting yourselves to the way we do things and to some spiritual disciplines. That's the second step in the process. It's the next move. The third thing that happens, look at verses 43 and 44. Check this out. It says, all the believers were together, and they had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he had need. This is interesting. In this context, what happens is people gave the gifts that were given to them. God had blessed these people generously. He had taken care of them, and they were so filled with awe and so committed to each other. They said, you know what I have, I'm willing to give to you. I'm willing to leverage the gifts that God has given to me so that the whole community can advance. Do you know how this is represented in our church? It's called volunteering. You know what happens when we volunteer? We take the gifts that God has given to us. Some of you, God has given a leadership gift. Some of you, God's given an administrative gift. Some of you, God has given an extroverted spirit, and you are amazing at meeting new people. Some of you, God has given the gift of giving. God has given each one of us gifts spiritual gifts, gifts that we can use. But for many of us, we have never leveraged those gifts on behalf of the kingdom of God. Can I just challenge you with this? Do you really want to get to heaven one day and stand before Jesus and never stand there and let him talk to you and let him say to you, gosh, Whit, I gave you a leadership gift. What percentage of that leadership gift did you use building your kingdom? What percentage did you use building mine? God has given you a gift. And our church and our community, our South Campus, suffers when you don't engage your gift. God's given you a gift, and we want to leverage it and use it because we're all in this together. This is what represents, this was one of the earmarks of the early churches, that they leveraged what God had given them for the benefit of their community, for the benefit of what God was doing in their church. Are you willing to leverage the gifts that God has given you to push Church on the Move forward? Some of you, you've never volunteered here, never. You've always had a reason. Well, I'm just too busy. I got too much to do. There was a friend of mine who was talking to one of the members of our church. He kind of came in and asked for an opportunity in his section to do something kind of public, just to be kind of in a public place, to do something kind of where people could see him. And he said, why don't, before we do that, why don't you just start by leading a small group? Well, it's not a great time for me. It's just not the right time for me to be able to do that. And this section leader looked back at him and he said, when will it ever be a good time? It's never a good time. There's never a perfect time where you go, you know what, I got nothing else to do. Now's the time to start volunteering. You know what? That's why it's called sacrifice. Because it requires that we lay something down. Are you willing to lay down some things to say, God, I'm going to leverage my gift to build your kingdom, not my will, not my kingdom, but your will, your kingdom be done? Are you willing to do it? That's the third step. Number 4 is this. Check this verse out. It says this. Every day, look at this. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. And then look at this. They broke bread in their homes. This was more than just about a large group gathering. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Here's the last part of this. Small groups. This is how we get people engaged. We move them from, wow, I am like covered in paint. We move them from baptism to the next move, into volunteering in small groups. This is what we do at Church on the Move. Every ministry that we have feeds one of these 4 things: baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups. I think we should say that together. This is our strategy. This is our mantra. This is our rallying cry. Let's say this together. You ready? Here we go. Baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups. South Campus, we want to hear you with us. 180, we want to hear you with us. Let's say it again. Baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups. This is what we do. This is how we engage people. We take them through this process. We take them through baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups. You know what happens in small groups? People get connected. They get to take the mask off. People get to see the real them. They start to open up and share some of the things that are really going on in their life. Real life change begins to happen when you begin to get real with somebody next to you. How many of you would say, remember this on night 2, when Judd talked about how many of you were brought by somebody else? How many of you would say that a significant moment in your life spiritually, you took major steps forward because of a strategic relationship that you know God placed in your life? Can I just see your hands? Look at you guys. Almost everybody's got their hands raised. Why? It's because God works through relationships. We see it in the early church. It's what's happening in our church. Guys, we have small group opportunities that are happening right now. This weekend and next weekend are strategic opportunities for you to get involved in small groups, to be a part of a small group. You want to grow spiritually? You came to this revival. You're all charged up. You're ready to, charge hell with a squirt gun, all that good stuff, which is fantastic. You know how you keep this going? You get in a small group. You start volunteering. The worst thing in the world that you could do is go right back into the same old routine. Become a part of something. Start volunteering. Join a team. Be a part of a small group and watch and see what God does in your life. You might not be able to make all 12 weeks of your small group, but go to 10 of them. Go to 8 of them. Go to 6 of them. 6 is better than 0. At least you came to some. But be a part of them. Join a small group. We're going to have tables in the lobby this weekend. You can go to groups.churchonthemove.com. Here's a cool thing that we just launched. You go to groups.churchonthemove.com, you can see a list of all the groups that we have, who's leading them, what their topics are. That way, there's not going to be awkward conversations in the lobby. You can kind of find out what group is in your area and start to get connected. We're serious about you guys getting into groups because it matters, because life change happens inside of small groups. Baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups. This is what we do. It's not just a staff thing. It's not just a volunteer thing. It's not just for the elite few and at the center of the organization. This is for all of us, every single one of us. Your strategy when you get somebody and you bring them to church, your first goal is to get them baptized. The next thing, take them to the next move. Some of you are going to bring people who are new. Go to the next move with these people. It's so much easier to do something new when someone that you know is doing it with you. Go to the next move. Start volunteering, and then we want to get them into small groups. Now, here's the thing. We cannot guarantee that spiritual growth will happen because somebody goes through all 4 of these things. There's no way you can guarantee any process where somebody will grow spiritually. Here's what I'm going to tell you. People are going to go through this, and not much is going to change in their lives. But here's what I can tell you. We're creating the conditions for spiritual growth. It's interesting when the meteorologist tells you that it's going to rain. He doesn't know exactly that it's going to rain. He's just telling you that the conditions for rain or for a thunderstorm are present. That's what they do. They look at the conditions of the weather and they make a prediction. That's what this is. We can predict that the conditions for spiritual growth are much more likely when people go through each of these 4 steps. I can't guarantee it will happen, but I can tell you that it's much more likely to happen when people go through baptism, next move, volunteering, and small groups. I want to invite the band to come. We're going to wrap this thing up here in just a second. But I want to invite the band to come out. I'll close this thing down. Oh gosh, Heather and I have we've been trying to sell our house for the last 2 years. I've talked a little bit about that. It's just been a struggle getting our house sold, but we finally, in July, convinced somebody to come take that thing off of our hands. It was awesome. And that's a great feeling. Thank you, you're very kind. So they came, they loved the house, and so anyways, they put an offer in. You do the whole back and forth the negotiation thing, and they made us a great offer. We decided to accept, and so we had planned a vacation like the week before the closing, and we kind of said to ourselves, well, we can do this. We'll try to get as much work as we can done, before we go on vacation. And so Heather did all the work, really. I didn't do much of anything. And she got everything ready to go, and then we went on vacation. We took our family to the beach, and then we came back, and it was like 3-4 days we had to kind of get ready to just wrap this thing up and get out of the house. And so, moving is a stressful thing, but here's what I've noticed, and maybe you felt this too, that the end, like the last part of moving, like the last 2 hours, are awful. It's the most horrible experience. I'm convinced hell is a giant moving truck, and you're just putting stuff in it. That's what it is. And it's hot, and it's in Oklahoma. I mean, no doubt, humid. It's terrible. Why we, move in July is just like we couldn't move on a nice day, but that's what happened. And so, it's this just hot July day, and it's coming down to the end, and at the very end of moving, it gets crazy. For us, moving at our house is a little bit like the scene at the end of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the Ark of the Covenant is opened up and the power of God is shooting out and killing everyone. That's kind of what moving is like. It's this crazy thing where it's just crazy and mayhem everywhere, and words are being said, and we're angry with each other. I'm pretty sure I lost my salvation a couple times in that process. And at the very end, at the end of that scene, it's so great. The end of the scene, it's like that giant cloud goes up in the sky, and the lid to the ark is like spinning around like 1,000,000 miles an hour, and then the end of, it like, and the lid goes back into the ark. That's what moving was like. It's like we throw everything in the truck, you shut the door, and then boom, you're done. And that's what happened with us as we were leaving. And so we threw the last of our junk. It's all junk. I want to throw it all away. Just put it in the van, in my car, everything is stuffed. We had to rent another truck at the last minute. It was miserable. We get it all in there, and it's just, it's awful. So we're done. And then Heather and I, we say, let's take one last walk through the house. And I got to tell you, man, emotionally, I was just drained. I was just angry. I wanted to leave. I didn't want to have any part of it. But we walked back through the house. And it was just amazing as we walked back through that empty house. And in particular, going upstairs and looking in our kids' rooms. And seeing where we had read stories with them, and prayed over them, played with them. Brought 2 kids home from the hospital to the house. God was good to us there. And I was struck by something. I love this house. Much as I'm ready to move, I love this place. But here's what's interesting. I love it for completely different reasons at the end than I did in the beginning. I wasn't walking through the house going, man, I love the square footage of this house. These rooms are so big, and I love these countertops, and gosh, look at this tile. Wow, this is so nice. I'm going to miss this shower. None of that was on my mind. That's because that house had become a home. That's the power of what happens when the heart is engaged. For some of you, this church has just been a house. It's just a place you show up. Maybe you admire certain qualities, certain things about our church that you find useful. It's like the square footage of a house, or a particular bathroom that you enjoy, or a kitchen layout that you like, or a floor plan that you think is interesting. It serves a purpose. But for you, it hasn't really engaged your heart. Guys, we got work to do. There's a lot of people in our city who need Jesus. And it's not going to happen with people who just attend. It will only happen when we're all engaged, pulling towards the same objective: baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups, just like they did in Acts. Baptism, next move, volunteering, small groups. We're pulling toward the same thing. I pray that as a result of this revival, your heart would be lit on fire to be engaged in our church, to do something with the gifts that God has given you, to not just sit and observe, but to play an active part, from teenagers all the way up to our senior citizens. We want to see everybody because we're a family. We're not just one demographic, we're the whole thing. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for what you're doing in our church through this revival. Lord, thank you for lighting our hearts on fire. Lord, I pray that no longer would we just be casual spectators, people who just sit back. We're on the bench. We're not really in the game. Lord, I pray that you would light people on fire this week to get in the game, to use their gifts. Lord, you've uniquely designed people. Our church is missing something because they aren't involved, because they're not leveraging the gift that you gave them. Lord, there are leaders in this place, people who could lead huge ministries here. They could be a part of something great. Lord, I pray you would stir in them right now to join, to be a part, to engage, to pull in the same direction. Lord, there are people who've got amazing gifts. We don't even know what is sitting right here in this room, sitting out in our South Campus. Lord, I pray you would speak to us. May we hear your voice clearly. Lord, we would choose to engage, to be a part of the hope of the world, the local church. God, we love you and we thank you. It's in Jesus' name, everybody said, amen.